After picking a fight with God over his unlucky life, a failed reporter is given divine powers to control the entire planet for a week. Today we're going to recap the story of the 2003 movie, Bruce Almighty, from 2003. One morning in the city of Buffalo, reporter Bruce Nolan is recording a news story about a bakery. Despite being dissatisfied with his work, he follows the recording with his good humor and wants to prove that the bakery has the biggest cookie in town. When the cookie is ready, it surpasses the city record and Bruce's story is a success. To celebrate, everyone around eats cookies while the reporter serves the guests. Later, Bruce reviews the story with his girlfriend, Grace. She says she loved what she saw and tries to support him, but he believes that these funny recordings will never make him a news anchor. The next morning, Bruce starts his routine for work. However, things get off to a bad start when the news announces that his field hockey team has lost the game and, shortly afterwards, his dog Sam goes potty in the house. To make matters worse, he has to get to the newspaper early for a meeting about the day's stories. Before that, he drops Grace off at work, where a blood drive is taking place. She says it's a good deed to help other people, especially as her blood type is very rare. Despite this, Bruce doesn't like the idea and says goodbye, but before he does, Grace gives him a necklace made by her students to bring him luck. Unfortunately, the necklace doesn't work and Bruce gets stuck in a traffic jam. When he arrives at work late, the meeting is already over and the story chosen is that of Evan Baxter, a reporter and Bruce's greatest rival. The two vie for the anchor spot, but Evan always finds a way to get ahead. Desperate, Bruce talks to his supervisor and friend Jack, who offers him an opportunity to broadcast a live report from Niagara Falls. Bruce accepts and, a few moments later, goes to make the recording on the Maid of the Mist ship, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary. The reporter prepares to interview the ship's owner, but during the broadcast, the newspaper announces that its main anchor is quitting. The problem is that Evan offers to do this farewell and even announces that he will be the new anchor for everyone. Discovering that he's been passed over by his colleague, Bruce has a nervous breakdown and, as well as sabotaging the story, swears at everyone on the live show. As expected, the reporter is fired. Disgusted, Bruce picks up his things and goes to his car, but he sees a homeless man being attacked by a gang. He arrives on the scene to defend the guy, but the gang doesn't like it at all and they all run after the reporter. Bruce tries to run away, but the thugs catch him, beat him up and scratch his car door. Later, Bruce returns home and starts blaming God for all his problems. Grace tries to comfort him, but he won't accept her help and says he can't stand their mediocre life any longer. These words hurt Grace, but Bruce doesn't care and decides to leave the house to cool off. Minutes later, on the road, the reporter tries to ask God for a miracle, with as much faith as he can muster. He takes the opportunity to pick up the amulet Grace gave him, but accidentally drops it in the car. Bruce tries to pick it up, but doesn't pay attention to the road and his car crashes into a lamppost, destroying the entire hood. Fortunately, Bruce wasn't hurt, but this accident became the last straw in his life. He then throws the necklace into the middle of the sea and starts taunting God, saying that he has abandoned him and that he doesn't do his job properly. Suddenly, his beeper starts ringing and shows a mysterious number, but Bruce just ignores it. The next day, he keeps getting calls from the same phone, which makes him lose his temper and throw the beeper out of the window into the street. Just then, Sam goes back to potty in the house and Bruce takes him outside. To his surprise, he sees that the beeper is still ringing, even though it's completely destroyed, with the number that called earlier. Intrigued by this, Bruce decides to answer the call and receives a very tempting job offer. He goes to the address, but finds an abandoned building in a strange alley. The place doesn't look too promising for him and it gets even worse when Bruce gets distracted and steps in a mud puddle. Nevertheless, he decides to go ahead and when he enters the building, he meets a janitor. The guy tells him to go up to the 7th floor, but first he asks Bruce to help him with the cleaning. Confused, the reporter just says that on the 7th, at 7 o'clock, he'll help him, and the janitor just agrees. Arriving on the 7th floor, Bruce finds an empty corridor where an electrician is fixing the light. However, the guy turns out to be the same man who used to work as a janitor. If that wasn't enough, in a matter of seconds, he changes his uniform for a white suit and tie, proving that he is also the owner of the place. Bruce finds the whole thing strange, but it gets worse when the mysterious man claims to know everything about his life, which is recorded in a cupboard in the living room. Intrigued, Bruce goes to the cupboard to investigate, but when he opens it, a gigantic drawer comes out and pushes him away. The man then takes one of the files and talks about the night before, when Bruce accused God of not doing his job. Frightened by all this, he asks who the mysterious man is, who replies that he is none other than God. Bruce finds this absurd and tries to prove that it's all a deception. He challenges God to guess how many fingers he has raised, but the Lord gets it right every time. In yet another attempt, Bruce cheats and puts on 7 fingers, but then changes to 5, but his hand gains 2 extra fingers, which sends him into a panic. After this scare, God makes Bruce an offer to have his powers for a week and prove that he can do God's work better than he can. Bruce agrees, but only to get out of the place as quickly as possible. He rushes towards the car and steps into the same puddle as before, only instead of sinking his foot in, he walks over the water. Even so, Bruce thinks it was all an invention in his head and gets into the car. He tries to start it with the key and can't, but when he commands it with his voice, the car suddenly starts. Still unable to believe what is happening, Bruce ends up in a diner. While waiting for his coffee, he decides to see if he really has God's powers. First, he pulls out the sugar jar with the power of his mind and then manages to summon a spoon, which comes out of his mouth. Finally, when the attendant brings him some soup, he uses his power to separate it, just as Moses did with the Red Sea. At that moment, God appears before him and calls him to explain everything that has happened. As the two walk through the water, the Creator says that over the course of the week, Bruce will have all his powers. However, there are 2 conditions. He can't reveal to others that he is God and he can't interfere with people's free will. Finally, God says goodbye and leaves his task for Bruce to fulfill. So, with the powers of the Almighty, the reporter begins to test them out on the street and uses them to change his ordinary clothes for more elegant ones. However, his target is now the gang that beat him up the day before. He finally finds them in an alley and orders them all to apologize for the sin of attacking him. Not believing what they've heard, the whole gang starts laughing and the leader says he'll only ask for forgiveness if a monkey comes out of him. To his misfortune, Bruce complies and a monkey comes out of him. When they see this, the other members get scared and run for their lives, but Bruce shoots a swarm of bees out of his mouth to chase them. Before leaving, the all-powerful Bruce orders the monkey to return to where he came from, much to the subject's misfortune. When evening comes, Bruce returns home, ready to reconcile with Grace. He brings flowers, plays romantic music and uses his power to clear the clouds from the sky and bring the moon closer to the window. Thanks to this, the two make up and enjoy the best night of their lives. However, the next day, while Grace is having coffee, she sees a news report about tsunamis hitting Japan. The news also reports that the waves were caused by a strange movement of the moon, i.e. the fault of what Bruce did the night before. While he was sleeping, Bruce began to hear voices in his head that sounded like orders. He ignores them, has coffee with Grace and sets off to get his job back at the newspaper. Outside the house, he gets into his old wrecked car and turns it into a luxury vehicle with his divine power. On the way, he comes across another traffic jam, but with a simple flick of his fingers, he pushes all the cars aside and speeds past. Minutes later, Bruce arrives at a dog training center. However, a rival journalist has already recorded the story and starts taking advantage of having arrived first. Nevertheless, the reporter uses his divine powers and, at the same moment, a dog starts digging in the middle of the field. After digging a large hole, the dog finds the missing body of a great authority in the United States. When they see what the dog has found, the news team try to get their equipment from the van, but Bruce locks the doors. With no other competitors around, he grabs his camera and records this unique and exclusive story. What's more, he seizes the chance to take revenge on the rival reporter and fills his car with tons of illegal substances. Later, the success of the report leads Bruce to be acclaimed at the newspaper where he used to work, including by the anchor, Susan Ortega. He then meets with Jack, who can't hire him as an anchor now, but promises to give him his job back if he brings in more stories. Bruce wastes no time in using divine intervention to get the best stories. At a food fair, he conjures up a meteor, which falls in the middle of a nearby field. Thanks to news like this, Bruce becomes known as one of the best reporters in the country. He's very happy about all this, but he still has some unfinished business to take care of. One day at work, he sees Evan as the new news anchor and decides to take revenge. He uses his power to mess with Evan's voice, change the text on the teleprompter and even control his rival's mouth and make him say nonsensical things. Because of this joke, Evan loses his anchor position. With this news, Bruce decides to celebrate and calls Grace for a romantic dinner. Later, she and her sister, Debbie, go to a spa for relaxation. She talks about the long-awaited dinner and her sister believes that Bruce is finally going to propose. Full of expectations, Grace goes with Bruce to dinner at a fine restaurant. At that moment, the reporter approaches his girlfriend to give her some important news, but she is disappointed to discover that the news was about his promotion to anchor. Before she can express her disappointment, Bruce begins to be tormented by the voices in his head. He then leaves the restaurant to try to calm down until he suddenly ends up on Mount Everest. There, he meets God, who warns him about the voices. He explains that they are prayers from the residents of Buffalo and that if Bruce continues to ignore them, they will accumulate more and more. Back at home, Bruce tries to organize people's prayers into files and notes, but none of these options work. Finally, he decides to put them all in the form of emails on a computer. Although the idea is good, thousands of messages soon appear at the same time and, even though Bruce answers them all quickly, more prayers appear. To make his life easier, he decides to grant everyone's requests at the same time, without thinking about the consequences of this decision. Later, Bruce goes to a work party, but Grace doesn't want to go because she's still fighting with him about the night before. He leaves her a message on the phone, at which point Susan appears in front of him and tries to win him over. Bruce ends up giving in, just as Grace arrives at the party and sees everything. Hurt, she decides to put an end to their relationship and leaves for her sister's house. The next day, Grace starts her routine and begins to receive strange signals, such as messages in trees and clouds with declarations of love. Unbeknownst to her, they were all sent by Bruce to convince her to get back together. Even so, none of this helps and she remains firm in her decision. So Bruce decides to go to the school where she works so that they can talk. There, he tries to make amends and asks her to come back, but Grace won't accept. With no choice, he tries to use his divine power to make Grace love him again, but nothing happens, because as God has warned him, he cannot interfere with free will. Hours later, Bruce's big debut as an anchorman is about to take place. However, the news reports that the meteor he invoked has caused the destruction of several power transformers, causing a power outage throughout the city. To make matters worse, when Bruce answered yes to the prayers of all the residents of Buffalo, he accidentally fulfilled the wish of most of them, which was to win the lottery. Because of this, hundreds of people won, but they won little more than $10 each. The residents are outraged by this and start wreaking havoc all over the city. Nevertheless, Bruce is preparing to fulfill his dream in front of the cameras. Just as the news is about to start, the lights go out due to a power cut. Bruce manages to activate them again, but the lights keep going out. The reporter starts to get frustrated and tries to get through the news as quickly as he can. However, Jack stops the broadcast and warns that, outside the newspaper, people are causing a huge riot. Realizing that the whole town has gone mad because of him, Bruce decides to leave the show and resolve the situation. Outside, the city of Buffalo has become a living hell. Residents attack each other, set cars on fire and rob all the stores in the neighborhood. Bruce despairs and asks for God's help. In doing so, he is teleported to the building where he received the Almighty's powers, but he doesn't find him there. Seconds later, God appears, once again dressed as a janitor. Bruce tells him what happened, but God replies that he arrived at the time he promised, that is, on the 7th at 7 a.m. So he hands the reporter a mop and the two of them clean up the whole place. Bruce soon realizes that by mopping the floor of the building, they have also cleaned up all the mess in the city and everything is back to normal. Even so, Bruce asks how he can do his job and help people. God replies that he won't be able to do this with divine power, but with his own efforts, and that only then will he be able to perform miracles. God says goodbye and then Bruce returns home, still feeling sorry for having pushed Grace away. To make up for it, he decides to finish the photo album of the two of them to give her as a present. The next day, on his way to work, Bruce faces yet another traffic jam, but instead of using his powers, he follows God's advice and waits. Just then, he sees a man with a broken car and decides to help him with his own efforts. When he arrives at work, Bruce takes another benevolent approach and gives Evan his anchor position back, as well as settling his differences with his colleague. He then asks Jack for his job back as a reporter, as he wants to continue with stories that make people laugh. Finally, he returns home and teaches his dog Sam to go outside. Despite many attempts, he finally succeeds and celebrates his victory with his friend. Just then, Debbie appears and says she's come to collect her sister's things. Unable to accept that it's all over, Bruce lets her in and hands her the photo album. Moved by this act, Debbie tells Bruce that even though they are separated, Grace always dedicates her prayers to him. Thanks to this, Bruce goes to his computer and finds his ex-girlfriend's prayers. Seconds later, a new message appears, indicating that Grace is in the middle of yet another prayer. Bruce travels there and realizes that she is asking God to allow her to forget him, because she still loves him. Devastated by these words, Bruce walks through the rain, feeling even more guilty for not having valued Grace. He kneels down in the middle of the road and asks God to help him. However, a speeding truck appears in front of him and he is run over. Shortly afterwards, Bruce appears as a spirit in a space full of light and meets God, who is waiting for him. The Almighty gives him back Grace's necklace and tells him that if he has a request to make, all he has to do is pray willingly. Bruce makes a request for the good of humanity, but God knows that his true desire is to get back with Grace. However, Bruce asks her to find someone who really appreciates her, as he should have done in life. This prayer convinces God and he decides to grant his request. He then shocks Bruce with his fingers, which causes his spirit to return to his body. Later, he wakes up in a hospital bed and sees that someone has donated a bag of blood to him of the same type as Grace's. Seconds later, he finds her in his room and realizes that she not only gave some of her blood, but also stayed by his side during his recovery. Bruce then asks for forgiveness for what he did and the two finally resume their relationship. A few days later, the reporter recovers from the accident and returns to work. This time, he covers a story about a blood donation campaign that Grace is taking part in and also announces their wedding on TV. The story is another success and for the first time in his life, Bruce is satisfied with his work. After the shoot is over, he meets up with Grace to donate blood as well. While the couple happily continue to do this good deed, nearby, the same homeless man Bruce helped appears on the scene, and suddenly, the man takes on the form of God. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.